We live in very absurd and horror-stricken times. The world is changing. We all saw what happened in Alaska, in Anchorage, when President Vladimir Putin, went over there for a state visit. First time so many years. See, the former U.S. President Biden, has been very unwilling to, to even have any or entertain any type of discussions with the Russians. So we saw what happened. So, well, the visit happened was a very flamboyant visit uh, of an august guest in President Vladimir Putin. See, there was before the visit, I think there was a press conference in Russia where one Russian lady was asking President Putin if he wasn't concerned about his security, and he answered simply and very calmly. He said, "My security in Anchorage doesn't depend on the good faith of the Americans, but on the Russian power and determination." Now he spoke in Russian, so this was translated in English. So I'm just speaking from that translation. Now you see, so many things have happened ever since then. I think it was just 3 days later the Europeans scrambled, for a response, and when President um, Zelensky, you know, was summoned by Trump to talk more about these issues. Now, the Europeans scrambled for an answer to that. So they all gathered, I think seven of them, you know. It was Ursula von der Leyen, there was this the German Chancellor Metz, there was, I think, the Italian lady Meloni, there was, you see, all of these guys, they all scrambled and rushed there in defense of their supposed ally, and they went to America. They called them the A team or whatever, without the consent of the European people, of course. And you saw what happened over there. They were bamboozled there at the White House. See, Trump was just playing with these guys, just playing with them. You dig? It was quite pitiful to watch. You know, people say that they were treated like school children. You know, when they themselves consider themselves to be allies. I keep saying this, that the Europeans are not allies of the Americans. The Europeans are chattels. I've written about these things, in my books. You see, the Europeans are chattels. Well, when you speak of an ally, you see, an ally, there's a certain amount of dignity in being an ally. But when you talk about a chattel, I mean, you are property, you have no value. So there is no sense of dignity in that. And Trump was very plain, and telling them that this is how it's going to be because, well, he has discussed with the Russians. He knows. You see, the Americans have a pretty good sense of what is going on over there. They know. The Americans know. They know that. You see, going to Ukraine, they're talking about the security guarantees over there that they're thinking about going there. This no-fly zone. Who's going to do the no-fly zone? They think that it's Libya. Who's going to implement no-fly zone? You know, um, they want to implement the no-fly zone, and they're trying to entrap the Americans into providing them with air cover as the dream of going into Ukraine. You know, so those are some very fascinating issues to observe. So the Americans are very fast. So they've backed out of that. They know exactly what awaits them over there. So if the Europeans, let me specify that if the EU wants to, send soldiers over there, let them go ahead and find out. Why you try to stop them now? Don't stop them. They're very close to that. Let them go ahead and find out. Russia is an impenetrable fortress. You cannot defeat the Russians in Ukraine. By the way, when they speak about Russian intervention in Ukraine, they speak as though Russia's just invaded Ukraine. That's the word they use. The Russian invasion, Putin's war, all those type of things. Now, when you fail to address the underlying causes You see, the proximate causes of a problem. You see, the precipitating causes of a problem. When you don't address those problems or those issues, you can never be able to actually solve the problem that you talk about. You're trying to talk about the effects of something that is very profound, an existential menace, an existential threat to the Russian people. You see what happened to the people of Eastern Ukraine who incidentally do not want to be part of Ukraine anymore? What happened to them? Why are they fighting? Why do they no longer want to be part of Ukraine anymore? You see, because if it is that these people were not uh, in line with what the Russians are doing, they will not make it easy for the Russians to be around them. You know, so when you're saying that the Russians organized a referendum, without the consent of the Ukrainian people, what people are you talking about? You know, how do you measure that? What metrics have you used to measure what those people think? What the people of Eastern Ukraine, what do they think about this whole thing? It didn't start in 2022, on 24th of February. That's not. You see, that's just a culmination of things that have been happening for so many years. The Russian military intervention in Ukraine. The Russians themselves speak of special operation. They don't call it a military intervention. They don't even call it a war. But the one thing they're waiting for is when the Europeans or the EU intervenes officially, because right now they have soldiers there, they have all these mercenaries and all those type of things. But when they intervene officially, you see, that is when the Russians are going to declare war. And I've said that this whole thing in Ukraine is going to transform that country into an adulterated cemetery deep within the bowels of Eurasia. That's exactly what is happening. They don't tell you exactly how many people have died over there. But then the question is, can a country like Sweden, you know, afford to lose 500 soldiers in one day? That is the rate of death in that place. You know, can Sweden lose 500 soldiers in one day? I know Sweden very well. I've been I've been living there for many years, so I know. Hmm? I don't understand. Why is it that Sweden allows Americans to have access to over 16 or 17 military bases, or no, not over 17 military bases in Sweden without the consent of the Swedes? The Swedish people would never ask this question. No, this thing was imposed on them. This thing was thrust upon them by the Americans, by the EU bureaucrats who are unelected. You see? So those are the things that are happening there. For the Russians, this problem is pretty much existential. It's not a joke for these people. You know, they're going to fight. The Americans were saying Biden and Lloyd Austin, all these guys, they were always chanting, we're going to fight to the last Ukrainian. No, but the Russians, they're going to fight for their lives. It's pretty much existential for them. That's a great power. How do you defeat Russia and Ukraine? How do you even entertain that idea? You see that immorality, yeah, hmm? We understand that during when the Berlin Wall crumbled, and the Russians and the Americans decided that okay, NATO was not going to expand to the east, but NATO is in Ukraine, NATO is in Finland, NATO is in Sweden, NATO is everywhere. And the argument is that it is not that they are expanding to Ukraine, it is that the countries are moving. The countries that are close to Russia's borders are moving toward the west. That's the argument that they're using. But the thing is that by moving towards the west, they are moving to Russia's border. You see, they're expanding the border, and that was not supposed to happen. Well, they're saying that there was no agreement. There was no agreement, so they can actually just decide what they want to do and just think that the Russians are going to accept that. But you see, sometimes when people continue to push, it snaps. You dig? In the study of cooperation, when you don't perceive cooperation in terms of a mutuality of benefits, what happens is that you defect from it. You defect from it. That's what you can sign a treaty with someone, and if you don't perceive that treaty to be beneficial to you, if you don't perceive that treaty in terms of a mutuality of benefits, what you have to do is that you have to defect from it. And it's like even in your home, if you have a woman or hey who disrespects you, you come home and she's shouting at you and all those things. You say, but look, I didn't sign up for this nonsense. You see, you walk away. And, that's how it is. That's how it happens. Now you can imagine the level of intellectual. I don't know what can I say. What word is really appropriate to say? You see, treachery. You're not allowed to speak. I mean, many people are afraid to talk because they can lose their jobs. All the people that taught you all this, or taught us all these wonderful concepts in Europe, about wars, about political theory, you see institutionalism. All these people, very brilliant teachers in Europe, in Scandinavia, Sweden, but these people they're nowhere to be found. You know, when the world needs to hear their voices, they're all in hiding. You dig? You hear mostly the Americans. You see Professor John Mearsheimer, whose books I read when I studied. I took a course in international security policy. You see, I read his books then. Yeah, Professor Jeffrey Sachs. You see, many of them. I mean, those are the principal ones that you see all over YouTube. And they say, well, you feel that you've been robbed, spending thousands upon thousands of hundreds of thousands of dollars to study for your degree or your degrees, in my case. And then the people tell you that those degrees don't make any sense. You know, you see, those are the things. Huh? See, the level of intellectual stagnation is incredible in this Europe, in Europe, or let me just say in the Western world. How do you go and defeat Russia and Ukraine? How do you even entertain that kind of idea? You know, the Europeans want to find out. You see, they want to go and attack. They want to go and intervene. You see, but I said to this Macron, look, you see, you're calling the Russians. What did he say about Russia? He said the Russians are predators. He made a statement there that a country with about, I mean, with this a military of over 1 million needs to feed the soldiers. So, and this in that case, this country would have to engage in predation to survive. But Macron forgets that what his country has been doing in Africa for over 140 years. Not just one African country. I mean, France is, you know, oppressing. I think it's about 14 or 15 African countries now that are in the framework of this so-called France Afrique. You see, now the French could not fight against the Russians in Mali, in Burkina Faso, and in Niger. How will you go and fight the Russians in Ukraine, which is right there at the doorstep of the Russian sphere of influence? How do you fight Russia there? You know, those are the kind of things that people, the kinds of questions people want to avoid asking. But those are the questions that people must ask themselves, must ask their leaders, must pose to their leaders. We live in very absurd and horror-stricken times. But you see, the pictures that came out of the White House, Trump was basically just playing these people down, just playing with them, playing with them, smiling and laughing at them. He was sitting over there, sitting alone. Now remember what happened during the Berlin Conference of 1884, 1885. It took 3 months for these European leaders convened by the German Chancellor, the perverse Chancellor of Germany, Otto von Bismarck, convened these people. Now there were 14 countries there, and the US was among those countries. Sweden and Norway were present, but they were one country at the time. The Russians were present there too at the Berlin Conference, but the Russians refused to take part in the dismembering of Africa. You dig? The Americans were not strong enough at the time, so they didn't take part. So the Americans are thinking now. Trump has become like is sitting where Otto von Bismarck was sitting, and look at the minions you see around him, the Europeans all sitting there. Meloni was folding her arms, crossing her arms, and they say she was rolling her eyes and whatever she's doing. I love Italy, a beautiful country. I love Venice, I love the mountains. You see, it reminds me of where I come from. I'm a child of the mountains, you see. But then you go and see, you go to, you drive around from Venice to Feltre, all those places, you see, Treviso, all those areas. You see those beautiful mountains, it's like you begin to wonder what actually happened here. Now, you can have a beautiful country like that, a rich history of the Roman Empire, and then you come and you actually submitting yourself. That was total submission. You see, total subordination. You see, in front of the American, the lordly American leader. He was basically just dictating on them. You know, they sat there and they were watching, speechless. The German leader, by the way, who even gives the Germans the you see the authority to speak when it comes to peace building? Didn't the Germans start 2 world wars? And the country, my own country, Cameroon, has not recovered ever since then. Now we are fighting a silly war of colonization, an imperial war. The so-called Anglophones fighting against the so-called Francophones. And people forget that this war took its roots in the German defeat during the First World War. And that country was dismembered between the French and the British. So there was a new scramble for that country by these two imperialistic powers. You dig? We don't talk so much about that, but those are the things that happened. Now, the German Chancellor, Metz, you know, tried to, he tried to say something there, we need a ceasefire. He kept on asking ceasefire. No, you don't talk about the ceasefire when the Russians are out for total military defeat, you know, a ceasefire. Why do you need a ceasefire? You've been supporting this thing for the past, I don't know how many years. President Biden was there 4 years. He struggled for 4 years and it's totally nowhere to be found. You don't hear about Biden. You don't hear about Lloyd Austin. You don't hear about Anthony Blinken. You don't hear about all these guys. They've all disappeared. They've all disappeared from the scene. Now they want this thing to continue. They want this treachery to continue. But this new person has said, "Well, no, I don't want to continue," because you see, the problem or the chances of that, Trump, Trump might get stuck over there because the more he tries to extend or to prolong the support for Ukraine, the greater the chances that he's going to get embroiled in that situation, in the senseless war situation, and it's going to get bogged down over there. He has lots of problems back home, domestic problems he has to solve. You know, it's not as though he has all the time in the world. He doesn't have all the time in the world to solve all his problems. He has the problems with the immigrants that he wants to deport. He wants to clean up the country of criminals and all those kind of things. He wants to try to refurbish the image of this country. America is a dying empire. Hmm? It's scrambling, scraping to survive. It's trying to hold on. You know, that's how it is. When empires fall, it's always like that. If you read the histories of empires, you read the history of the Roman Empire, you see the Ottoman Empire. All of those empires is very similar. You know, scrambling to survive, grasping at straws. So Trump is trying to delay this. The fall of this empire, which is quite imminent. It's not going to happen today, but the process is already ongoing. You dig? Yeah. So I don't really understand. I don't really know if the Europeans understand what is going on in Ukraine. They don't really understand it. When the war started, you had American opportunists like a guy called Malcolm Nance, whom I've written about in one of my books. You see, Malcolm Nance, he came and said that we're fighting together or fighting alongside the Ukrainians, like a brotherhood in the military. You see, Malcolm Nance is nowhere to be found. There are problems in America that should preoccupy someone like Malcolm Nance. You see, who's trying to share common humanity with his own persecutors within the country called America. You know? So those are the kinds of things that people have to sit down and try to reflect on. The war in Ukraine is going to be something that the Europeans would regret having started because, well, they said that Russia was weak, in the 90s. Well, it's not like that anymore. You know, if you understand structuralism, you would know that societies can disappear for centuries on ending, but these societies can reappear after generations have passed. You see, they can reemerge as new societies, and the children would not even know what happened in the past. They would lean on that history, you see, to find their own way in life. This is going to happen over there in Russia. It's going to happen even in Africa. You see, the memory of our ancestral glory in Africa has been totally erased from our collective memory. And when you tell the Africans today that, oh, your grandparents, oh, your ancestors were great, they tell you, well, where is the greatness? We can't see anything. Everywhere is bushes, everywhere is dust, everywhere is mud, everywhere is misery. That's what the Africans tell you. We can, yeah. But ask yourself this question. How is it that the Africans have been able to survive for hundreds of thousands of years in this world without all the technology, without the white man, without all these things? How did we survive? How did your ancestors survive? Now, because if it's the case that we were killing ourselves in Africa at the rate at which we do today, then there's a good chance that we will not be existing today. We would have been totally extinct by now. Well, but the fact that we are not doing, the fact that we are still alive, the fact that Africa's population is over 1 billion people, very soon it's about 1.5 billion people. This tells you that, well, there was something good that our ancestors did at the time that has been erased from our historical records. So when the French people tell you that the Africans they're not gotten down in history, what are they talking about? What exactly are they referring to? So those are the kind of things that we have to actually question. We have to question that knowledge. Yeah, because the lordly colonial overlords are speaking for us. The same thing they're doing to the Ukrainian people. The Ukrainians have been entrapped. That's what I call weaponized entrapment. They're falling victim to that. You see, they bluffed the Ukrainians into embracing this proxy war. And now they're trying to bluff their way out of this war. And the Ukrainians are bamboozled. They don't know what to do. You see them all over Europe. Sweden has about 45,000 Ukrainians. The country, as I understand, used to have about 45 million people. But now the population has drastically reduced. You see videos on YouTube where they are chasing soldiers, chasing civilians on the street to force them into the army. You dig? You see, that's not how you fight. That's not how you fight a war of resistance. By the way, you're fighting in a country where the people of Eastern Ukraine do not want to be part of Ukraine anymore. So it's not like the Russians are just there inside the country intervening against the will of the Ukrainian people. So we have to define who the Ukrainian people are. You see that? So those are the kinds of things that they're trying to omit from the story. The Ukrainians have to talk or to speak or to sing their own mournful song, and not rely on the Europeans to speak for them. Because the Europeans have something they're looking to get over there, and the Russians are in the way. How do you want to get? I wrote in my in volume 1 of Garrison Metropolis. I wrote that, you see, the Russians president is acting as a rational leader, right? A rational leader who has seen a crocodile nesting along the banks of the river where his home is found. He has to go and protect his children from this crocodile. See that? It's as simple as that. You come to my home and you're trying to threaten my family. I take out my gun, you know. You see, you come to my home. I know you want to come and hurt my kids. And you tell my kids that I want to take it, I want to kill your father because your father is not good for your people. I want to kill your father, and I'll give you a new father. I'm going to play the role of your father. Okay? Uh-huh. But you have to deal with the father first. So what is the role of a rational father? He has to protect his family, protect his woman, protect the children. You pick up the gun and go and get rid of that crocodile. That's what a rational actor does. You dig? There's no question about these things. I don't really know what we are discussing about. It's about cosmic resolve. You tell the Russians that you're going to weaken them and you're going to use Ukraine to do that, and you're going to do that for as long as it takes. Now, you don't say those things anymore. And all those guys that used to sing the song have all vanished in thin air. You don't hear about them anymore. Lloyd Austin kept saying that. Anthony Blinken kept saying that. These uh, all these people, this gang of imperialistic opportunists, you see, they've disappeared, taking hostage of a country and vanish in thin air. Now the businessman has come in the picture and says, okay, we have to take a new road. We have to go to a new direction now. Hmm? The only regret for me is that he could have done this. Donald Trump could have or ought to have. That's a responsibility. He ought to have done this right at the beginning. It would have been a lot easier, you see, to address, because the more this thing lasts, the more that struggle becomes institutionalized. And you know what about something about institutions? They're very stable. When something becomes institutionalized, it becomes very difficult to deal with them, to get rid of them. The Ukrainians have been trained to get money from the West. While the people in the West, in Sweden, in Denmark, in Germany, they're sick, they're poor, they go to the social system to get help, they don't get any help. They get treated with scorn, you know. But people are working and contributing money, and when they get sick, they go to ask for help from the state. They get little or no help. Find so many drunkards in Sweden, for instance, many homeless people. You see them all around begging and drinking alcohol and picking from the dumpsters, picking all these plastic bottles to go and recycle the bottles and get some money, while they're sending billions to Ukraine, while there are many Ukrainians in a country like Sweden traveling for free. You know, they're sending money to Ukraine, bringing refugees from Ukraine to Europe, taking care of those refugees, giving those refugees jobs, while there are people in Europe who cannot find a job. You see? That is how perverse this whole situation is. You see, it's going to take some time. When this thing ends, then people really analyze it. That's why when I analyze this thing in my book, I didn't want to say, I said, well, I'll leave this to the European educators, you see, the European researchers to work on, because we have to work on Africa. We have to work on Africa. We have a lot of work to do for Africa. You see, you don't get too preoccupied with all these European struggles, and forget to see how the struggles are coming to you. You see, you have to go and insulate your people against the struggle, against the by effects of the struggle, against the political ramifications of this struggle, which are also going to have psychosocial implications for our people. You did? So we have to shelter our children, our African children, our African people who don't really understand what's going on, because that is where they're going to go. That is where they're going to go when everything turns rancid, when everything turns sour. If they see that they cannot do anything, if it becomes totally obvious that they can't do anything about Ukraine, they're going to go to the soft targets. And you know that what that is, or who those people are, the African people. That is where they're going to go to. So keep your eyes open, because Our ancestors have suffered this fate for long. We don't understand this because they couldn't write books or they never wrote books. They told us some of these things, but they never wrote books. But if you see what is going on in Europe today, if you see the way the colonial overlords, these imperialist opportunists are doing today, if you see how they're acting today, you would see that you understand that truly the African ancestors had no chance. They stood no chance against these people. They stood no chance. So we have to do something about this before it gets too late. The world is changing. The world is never going to be the same again. The Russians are standing in the way in the pursuit of their own redemptive rehabilitation. It's going to happen. Ukraine is going to be defeated. There's no chance for Europe to defeat Russia. No one is going to defeat Russia and Ukraine. No one. Nobody. And like I've said, the Americans have a good sense of this. They understand what is going on over there. See, so they're trying to step out. They're trying to walk away from this without losing face. How would the Europeans walk away and accept defeat in Ukraine without losing face? That is the question. That is the research question. All right, I'll leave it at that. Have one fine day.